Worst-case climate predictions of 9 degrees Fahrenheit rise in global temperatures by the end of the century are no longer plausible. Study finds we've already done enough to reduce carbon emissions to avoid those extreme scenarios. Researchers reanalyzed a number of widely used climate prediction models. These are used by scientists to determine how likely scenarios are to happen. They are based on a range of factors, including policies and emission levels. The team found they used 15-year-old data that didn't consider changes in emission levels as a result of actions by governments, industry and individuals. They reveal the most extreme warming scenarios are no longer plausible. Well, frankly, anyone with common sense could have told them that. But the simple fact is that all the climate conferences, all the work of all the governments in the world have not had the slightest change to the rise of the CO2 curve. Here is the curve with all those climate conferences on it, and as you can see, not a single dent. In fact, the CO2 curve curves upwards because the output of CO2 has been accelerating. For a fair number of years now, China has been building extra coal power capacity, and today is actually burning more coal than all the rest of the world combined, and it's at record levels. Just take a look at this chart. This chart has a red line which shows the average of all the Alarmist climate models. And by the way, the worst case scenarios they're referring to in that report is even off the scale. See those grey lines there? It's way off the scale. Never considered plausible even by alarmists. But now look at the blue line, the actual what's happened. Look what's happened since about 2000. There's hardly any growth in temperature at all. So the measurements don't conform to the model. But if you believe this study, you're supposed to believe that the worst scenarios way off the scale here aren't going to happen now. And why? Because mankind has managed to take a lot of actions to reduce that possibility. That is delusional. Today, China is burning record amount of coal. The world is producing records amount of CO2. And the simple truth is, as a result of this, the world is a much better world. The science clearly shows that the increase in CO2 is a clear net benefit to the world. And as demonstrated in my other video, More CO2 Please, the science shows that increasing CO2 a lot now does not result in increased warming to any significant effect whatsoever. Okay, so the models are clearly running far too hot. But now let's take a look at the effect of all that extra CO2 on our planet. 32 scientists in 24 institutions across the world, in fact in 8 countries, using NASA satellite data, and published in the Alarmist Nature magazine, fully peer-reviewed, that work found that the Earth in a 35-year period greened by 14%, extra vegetation, extra tree leaves, extra trees, extra vegetation of all sorts, by 14%. And of that 14%, most of it was due to CO2, 10% due to CO2, in a 35-year period. As you can see, the vast Sahara Desert here has little to no vegetation, but there is some very good news about it, and for that, I'm going to read just what the research has shown. The southern border of the Sahara has been retreating since the early 1980s, making farming viable again in what was some of the most arid parts of Africa. There has been a spectacular regeneration of vegetation in the northern Burkina Faso, which was devastated by drought and advancing deserts just 20 years ago. It is now growing so much greener that families who fled to wetter coastal regions are starting to come back. There are now more trees, more grassland for livestock, and a 70% increase in yields of local cereals such as sorghum and millet in recent years. And by the way, I'm sorry for any of my pronunciations there. And today, every year, We are adding 3 times the size of the United Kingdom to the world's vegetation. But let's now take a look at the history of CO2. This graph goes back 570 million years to the Cambrian period here. And in that period, there was an explosion in life on Earth in the oceans that gave birth to all the modern forms of life we have today, including us. But please note, with CO2 levels at almost 6,000 parts per million, the oceans were not acidic. And yet today there's fear-mongering with CO2 levels of about 420 parts per million of the oceans turning acidic. So when CO2 was 15 times higher than today, we had a great deal of life, in fact the birth of life on Earth. Now, the temperature is shown by the turquoise line, and the CO2 here is shown by the purple line. As we went on through time though, we had ice ages come, and when ice ages come and the ocean's really cool, it absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere, so you get these big dips. But ignoring those, the pattern is a gradual decline in CO2. And the reason is simply this: CO2 is essential to all life. But when life absorbed it in the oceans, it died and it buried itself, forming, for example, our limestones. So as time went on until we got to here, the pre-industrial revolution, with the CO2 levels down to about 280 parts per million, we were in a CO2 drought. And indeed, our plants, most of them, had evolved in much higher CO2 levels in the thousands of parts per million. So we entered the industrial revolution in a CO2 drought. And that, by the way, is what the alarmists are trying to return us to today. So the alarmists are saying, no, let's have more desert back. Let's have all this vegetation, the extra vegetation I've shown you, gone. Let's starve ourselves. And by the way, at the same time, let us pay our farmers not to produce food, whilst we're paying our wind farms not to produce energy. Because when the wind chooses to blow, we often do not need it. And when we do need it, the wind often does not choose to blow. Therefore, we have to pay them not to produce power, and it's almost 50% of the time. We have entered a truly mad world, with some alarmists even calling for climate lockdowns. So on certain days you couldn't travel, on certain days you could. Complete control from the centre of your entire life. And all this in the totally bogus claim of trying to reduce CO2 to save extreme temperature rises. The truth is, we need more CO2, and the fact is that the man here filling his car with petrol or diesel is doing more to green the planet than all the activists in the world 1,000 times over. What we have to do is reduce pollution whilst we increase the amount of CO2, because pollution is not CO2. They're totally distinct. CO2 is the very food of life. Sadly, we are led by a mad Prime Minister who does not have any understanding of the subject he is dealing with when it comes to green energy. For example, just last year he promised 600,000 heat pumps a year would be installed. That's now changed down to 20,000. He wants to do away with your gas boilers, your cars and everything without any understanding of the costs. And to what effect would this lead? Would it actually reduce the CO2 in the world? Not at all. As we know from that first graph I showed you, the CO2 carries on growing regardless of what we do. And actually that is the good news. The good news is that regardless of the madness of our governments in the West, CO2 is still growing, and that's bringing major benefits to the planet. And it's not warming it like they said it would. But it is wasting enormous amounts of your money, and most of all, it's hitting the poor the hardest.